We're going to build a wall. It's going to be built. It's not even, believe it or not, it's not even a difficult thing to do.
Welcome to the Raid Class Roadhouse, everyone. The name's Dalton. Today I'm just kind of going over my build that I've been playing recently. This is a Frostbolt Icewall build. Of course, as you might expect, it's scaling Archmage. This is pretty much just the strongest way to scale Sorcerer's damage right now. Of course, there are other alternatives like Demon Form and Infernalist and stuff, but yes, Stormweaver Archmage is just overperforming greatly right now, and it'll likely see a little bit of a nerf, but hopefully the Archmage itself isn't nerfed too hard, and other things like Lightning Conduit and Spark are kind of seeing their own nerfs that won't really impact this build very much. Alright, so here's my character. As you can see, Everlasting Gaze and Mind Over Matter Eldritch Battery setup, along with Chaos Inoculation. This is just generic Archmage setup, making you take all damage from mana before life, converting all of your energy shield into mana so that you have a large mana pool, and then Chaos Inoculation so that you have a lot of protection against chaos damage, which will greatly improve your survivability. The main thing that makes that setup work, though, is the Everlasting Gaze Amulet, which gives you 22% of maximum mana as maximum energy shield. I don't know if this will be changed in the future, but currently, items like this that add mana from something, usually that happens after the conversion for some reason. For example, Ghost Writhe turns half of your health into energy shield, but even though you have 1 health, the conversion for some reason is still happening before your health is set to 1 and you still gain energy shield off of it. So, pretty interesting interaction. Hopefully it stays for this amulet at least. And that's kind of the core setup of the build. As for the actual skill, we're running Frostbolt and Frostwall with the Snake Pit Ring. This build does not function without the Snake Pit Ring. The core way that this functions is the Snake Pit Ring makes your Frostbolt not able to pierce, right? So normally if you shoot the projectiles, they'll just pierce through anything until they hit a wall like that and then they explode. Now, the Snake Pit Ring makes it where they can't pierce, and projectiles in your left ring slot fork. Fork. So, what fork does is it makes a projectile split into 2 additional projectiles. Now, normally the support gem for this makes it where the additional projectiles do, I think, like half damage, 50% less damage. So it's a dramatic downside for having fork, but this ring gives it to you for free. The only downside being that it takes one of your ring slots. But other than that, generically, the stats aren't too bad. It gives a nice little, chunk of cast speed, a little bit of spell damage, it's whatever, but it's at least some stats. And the way this functions with Frostbolt is you shoot it at an enemy, you put a frost wall behind the enemy, and it goes out, hits them once, explodes because it can't pierce them, it'll just explode instead, and then that explosion causes it to fork into 2 additional projectiles behind the enemy, which will then hit your wall and explode. So for every single projectile, you're getting a hit, an explosion, and 2 additional hits. So 3 explosions and a hit per, and with scatter shot here, you're shooting 3 projectiles. So every single shot, 3 projectiles, 3 hits, 3 explosions, split into 6 for an additional 6 explosions. So 3 hits and 9 explosions per shot. And that is where it gets kind of absurd. This frost pit ring honestly just took the build from 0 to 100 and made it start scaling off very quickly. The main real bread and butter of the build though is the frost walls. The build doesn't really function that well without the frost walls, which is why not only do I have my main frost wall here, I also have cast on freeze, which is running 2 frost walls and a flame wall with impetus, which will, once it gets another socket, I'll put the other energy jewel here. But yeah, just automatically casting frost walls as I freeze things. The frost walls put walls near enemies for the extra projectiles to be able to explode on, and it makes our clear very nice. And a lot of people might not really know this, but the frost wall itself actually does some crazy damage. You see this thing does 273 to 409 cold damage, but that's per section. So you see every single one of these sections that light up are individual sections, and all of those have their own damage for the explosion. So, I mean, if you have a very big boss that can be hit by all of those, it's going to do a drastic amount of damage. And when you place a frost wall, actually, if it's a bigger enemy, then generally they can't be moved. So the frost wall will automatically just explode when placed on them. So often you don't even need to cast frostbolts at them. You can just literally frost wall on them and they will just quite literally explode. Okay, now I'm going to go over a little bit of the finer details of my setup. One thing you might have noticed immediately, a lot of people aren't really running a main hand wand with a offhand scepter. I'm doing this for multiple reasons. For one, it gives you a very cheap way to get all the spirit required for things like Mage, which costs 100, cast on freeze costs another 60. Some people might want to run cast on crit, which is 100 instead of 60. Grim Feast, which vastly improves our survivability, is another 30. And the Arctic Armor, which you could potentially remove this. It's kind of whatever. But also things like, you know, I've got Clarity here on my Archmage, which gives me a little bit extra mana regen. It helps sustain the mana, it's pretty nice, but again, that's a little bit of extra spirit. Now, this can be accomplished with things like you could get the Oaksworn Shield for 50 spirit here, and a chest piece with a nice chunk of spirit. You can get upwards of 60 on them. And the reason I didn't do this is because, I mean, getting a chest piece with a lot of energy shield to be able to give you extra mana for your damage is fairly difficult and expensive if you're going to want to get, you know, a lot of energy shield and spirit tacked on there and, you know, whatever else you might want. I mean, it was enough for me, mostly playing an SSF kind of style, to get a 918 with even just a little bit of res on it. You know, I wanted to push the energy shield as high as I could. But this kind of allows you to get it a little bit cheaper. And not only that, if you get a Omen Scepter, it comes with level 18 Malice, which a lot of people use Orb of Winter, and this kind of takes the place of that. So it inflicts critical weakness every 0.66 seconds for this level 18, and it lasts for 4 seconds base, 1 extra second from the quality. But basically, whenever you're running around or fighting a boss, this is just building up to 10% extra crit chance on them, which is absolutely massive and saves you a gem spot, so you don't really need to use Orb of Winter. Well, you know, like I said, if you choose to swap this out for a shield and put in Orb of Winter, that's entirely viable and up to you. The stats I went for on this, I've got the +4 level of minion skill gems, and max mana, of course, mana regen. The main reason for the minion skills and why I actually chose to get that is because Grim Feast. Grim Feast actually has a minion tag, so getting those +4 global modifiers and boosting that energy shield per remnant helps our survivability in maps quite a large amount. As far as your weapon, this is kind of just generic, not too great, not too bad. The main thing I think you want over this is you don't really want critical spell damage bonus. It is okay, but for some reason it works differently than melee. For melee, it gives a huge boost to any sort of crit multi you have and just spikes your crit damage bonus through the roof. But on spells, it doesn't do this. It's just a flat 15%. So if you can afford it, you're going to be much better off getting that swapped with critical strike chance, and that'll kind of put your crit strike chance through the roof. You could probably easily get over 50% base crit chance, and then, you know, tack on the malice stacks with that. You're probably going to be, you know, nearing somewhere between 75 to 90% crit chance, I assume, something like that. So for our other gear pieces and just the gear in general, you're going to want to get as much energy shield and as much mana tacked onto every single piece that you can possibly get. You can see my gear is extremely mediocre. I've been playing mostly sort of SSF style with some trade for core things like the Everlasting Gaze and like a better weapon and stuff. But for the most part, SSF, so my gear is pretty whack. But if you get your resistances capped the best you possibly can, you really want good gear with a lot of resistance, because if you can afford to drop any of these ruins, you can see I'm still running, you know, got fire resistance here. You can drop these ruins if you have the extra resistance and replace them with these percent mana ruins, which will give you a little bit more survivability and damage. So that's the end goal. But yeah, overall, just a lot of energy shield, a lot of mana, and tack on some extra stats if you can. Intelligence will give you even more mana, and that's about all there is to it. So, important note, you can see here on our amulet we have allocates Icebreaker. This is done through the Delirium mechanic. You get these here, the distilled ire, guilt, etc. These can be used to allocate a passive. You can see here this one takes a ire, paranoia, and fear. You see the colors and everything if you hold Alt. This gives you 100% maximum energy shield as freeze threshold. Now, the reason that's important is because Chaos Inoculation sets our life to 1. And both freeze and stun threshold are based off of maximum life. So, if you take Chaos Inoculation and you do not have this, as soon as anything so much as touches you with any sort of cold damage, you are going to be immediately frozen. So this adds a nice layer of stun threshold, basically acting as if we had 2.6k life, and makes it so that we actually have to take a moderately large hit before we get frozen. Same is true for the Stone Charm. The the Stone Charm is used when you become stunned, so you can't be stunned. This is a little bit less reliable because it does not currently work on the hit that actually stuns you, which is fairly annoying. I hope they change how this functions, but for now, you get hit, you get stunned briefly, and then you cannot be stunned, so you're at least not chain stunned into death. You just have that split second where you stop, and then you keep going. Alternative for this, some people like to path over here, and then you get these nodes. 8% of energy shield is stun threshold, and then this one for 20%. This is definitely an option. I don't really like spending the extra skill points on this, so I use the Stone Charm, and it feels fine in my personal opinion. But yeah, if you don't have both of these or these passive nodes, you are going to die a lot, and it's not going to feel very good. So to quickly try to go over gem setup, you can see Sigil of Power here. This is provided by our offhand weapon. You don't need to manually swap to this. Whenever you cast Sigil, it will automatically swap and then cast it. No problem. Then we have our Frostbolt, which we are using with Scatter Shot, Arcane Tempo for more cast speed, Cold Mastery, and Wild Shards. Wild Shards is subjective. You could definitely take this off if you don't like it, if you just want to only fire forward. I really like it for the clear. It helps a lot, just kind of, randomly shooting off those projectiles everywhere, but whenever you do shoot those projectiles off, you can see that only one is firing forward, so it actually can be a DPS loss against some bosses. For Frost Wall, Spell Cascade, this is very important. You put down Spell or Frost Wall, it does 3 walls against big enemies that these walls automatically explode on. A lot of the time, this will just nuke them outright. But for some other enemies, oftentimes you can put this on and then it will kind of break some of the crystals or set up these walls around them and trap them in the middle of it, which not only is nice for survivability, it just kind of sets them up perfectly to be in the middle of all of the explosions, and then they just die. Throwing this on with some other generic damage supports, concentrated effect, consider casting, and second wind. This is actually very important. You can swap this off depending on your setup, but the use for this is it gives 6 charges of Frost Wall. Now we don't really need 6 charges of Frost Wall unless we're just spamming this thing around. We don't need that. But, as you can see, cannot support instant or triggered skills. For some reason, currently, if you put this on Frost Wall, you get 6 charges, and these 6 charges count for our Frost Walls that we have in our cast on freeze. So even though it can't support skills that are instant and triggered, it is supporting skills that are instant and triggered without even needing to be in the support gems. So this just means that we can use 2 Frost Wall setups so that we're just constantly spamming Frost Walls everywhere, and we're not really going to run out of charges unless there's just an absurd amount of monsters that we are freezing. Next up we have Frost Bomb. Frost Bomb is absolutely absurd for us. Not only does this, every time it does its little pulse, you can see here, it applies cold exposure, which applies negative 20% resistance. Add our Ascendancy, Scouring Winds, which lowers it by an additional 20%, so we have 40% base. Follow that up with 20% increased effect of the exposure from quality, and then you use Strip Away support to another 30% increased effect. It absolutely shreds. I think this thing is giving somewhere like 63% negative resistance to enemies right now, and apply hypothermia on top of that, this stuff is just going to melt. They're going to be well into the negative resistance and just be skyrocketing your damage. Now for this, I have Spell Echo, Energy Barrier, Strip Away, and Hypothermia has Focused Curse, Heightened Curse, and Expanse. We also have Mana Tempest. Mana Tempest is just a massive damage buff. You literally just toss this down, it just eats up your mana per second, and as you cast spells in it, it adds to the mana cost drain, but this is just a huge nuke. So we're just getting 3/4 of our damage tacked on as extra. It's massive. As far as all of our auras, I have Arctic Armor, Grim Feast, Archmage, and Cast on Freeze like we showed earlier. Arctic Armor I have linked with Glaciation, Deep Freeze, and Blind, so that if people do hit me, they are almost guaranteed to get frozen, freeze for a longer duration, and then if something does happen and they don't get frozen, they're blind, so they might have a hard time hitting me. This is the most... This is the one that can be removed the easiest if you want to. It's kind of whatever. A lot of enemies don't really get into melee range because we're doing so much freeze and so much range that it doesn't really matter a lot of the time. So if you happen to be able to get another 30 spirit, maybe you get a better scepter than I have, or a chest piece with a little bit of spirit. A good option would be to swap this off for blink. And if you don't have the spirit, you could even just do this as a weapon swap blink if you want to, which would work perfectly fine. And you're not going to be missing all that much. As far as the rest of these are pretty much necessary. You have to have these. Grim Feast is going to skyrocket your survivability whenever you're mapping. Anytime you get one of these remnants, we get 279 energy shield, up to double our maximum energy shield. This is overpowered. This is going to be nerfed. Archmage is also extremely strong, gaining crazy amounts of damage. This is also yet another thing you can expect to probably see a nerf to a little bit. These numbers are probably not going to stay exactly the same as they are. Cast on Freeze, as I said earlier, we've got the double frost walls with the frost flame wall. This is just as shown in the clip earlier. You're shooting everywhere, puts up the frost walls automatically, your forking frostbolts are hitting the frost walls, and everything dies. And frost flame wall adding just a little bit of extra damage on top of it. Okay, I think that about wraps it up. Not too much more I can think to really include right now. This is more of just a build showcase, what can be done with the Frostbolt and Frost Wall tech, than it is necessarily a build guide. Just felt like doing something different than, you know, the generic Spark stuff that everyone else is doing, and as you can see by my name, I wanted to kind of do an Ice Nova Frostbolts thing like PoE 1. Didn't really work out right now. Ice Nova isn't really feeling too great, or at least I couldn't get it feeling really that great. It was pretty underperforming in my opinion, but overall this has turned out fantastic. As soon as I got the Snake Pit ring and tested it and put it on, it just felt amazing, and I haven't looked back since. So I figured I would make a video, showcase this interaction a little bit, so that hopefully some other people, maybe some softcore blasters, can take this idea and, you know, expand upon it further. Maybe if Spark sees some nerfs, then, you know, this might rise up a little bit to kind of be on par with that. But overall right now, probably with Lightning Conduit and some of these other absurd things, is probably a little bit weaker than the Spark variants of Archmage, but that's okay. I'm having a lot of fun with it. just putting my balls in people's face and building walls as Trump intended. So I hope that kind of helps you guys and you enjoy this build if you decide to play it. If you have any questions, feel free to ask in the comments, and this is my first video ever, so I'm sure I'll see your comments and I'll reply. One final note before I go, this build has one major issue, and that issue is screen clarity and lag. As you can see, every single time I shoot one of these, it leaves this ice trail and puts chilled ground all over the place. And I mean, just look, you can see my FPS here, 114. As soon as I start shooting this everywhere, it just drops dramatically. This isn't really too big of an issue. It still plays okay for me. The main thing you need to have on dynamic resolution and dynamic culling. Maybe if you have a computer that's not a potato like I do, then this won't be necessary. But for me, with my little rig I've got, I have to have these on. You can see if I turn these off and then go back to the game, start casting stuff, it just gets, especially whenever the wild shard starts proccing, getting into the 20s FPS, and you know, as you can tell, that's in my hideout with no mobs at all. So, I mean, if you really want to test the limits of your PC, this might be the build to do it. Just because of the sheer amount of ground effects and shit you leave everywhere. So, best of luck, and hopefully you don't explode your computer.